Welcome to Paranormal M, where we explore the eerie and unexplainable. Join us on this journey by hitting the subscribe button and turning on notifications so you never miss out on any of our fascinating stories. Let's delve into the unknown together. Creepy Denim Guy. I went for a day hike up at Lake Blanch Trail several years ago during early autumn. If you live in Utah, I recommend this one, particularly during that season. Gorgeous mix of red leaves and pines. The guide says strenuous, but it isn't that hard, just a handful of steep parts. The trail is otherwise very wide and easy. Anyways, I was on my way back down and I was going through a steep section of the trail that has a bunch of large boulders and drops that you normally go around. That's when I heard a rustle in the brush. I turned to face the direction of the sound, thinking it was probably a deer, although something like a bear isn't totally impossible either. Since I've been almost run over by a deer by accidentally sneaking up behind them before, I like to give them a wide berth and let them know I'm there. Well, it wasn't a deer. About 15 feet away in the heavy foliage, I could see a person wearing a bunch of thick denim. Some branches obscured his face, so I never got to see what he looked like. As I took a few more steps, I also noticed that he was turning his whole body toward me. As I moved, he had his arms raised and hands in a grabby, claw-like position. Okay, not normal. The next thing that came to me was that this guy was a trail rapist. I'm not a woman though, so I wasn't afraid of that. I was more afraid that he would come after me because I noticed this hiding spot, or would settle for good old-fashioned mugging instead. So I leapt down those boulders in a way that would have made a mountain goat proud. I heard some loud rustling, but I didn't bother looking back. I knew that there was no way for him to catch me at the rate I was going. Near the entrance to the trail, I came upon two middle-aged women hikers and told them to rethink about going up because of what I saw. When I got back to cell-receptive territory, I phoned the sheriff's department about it, and they said they'd let the rangers know. Never heard anything more about it again. The creepiest moment, though, was seeing the way his arms were raised and how he pivoted towards me the whole time. Noped out like a pro. For some reason in my mid to late teens, there is a trend where I came across a lot of shadow figures. In addition, multiple close friends at different times would tell me that they felt a second personality growing inside of them. Even they would all confess that this second personality didn't like me. These friends were in different cities, unaware of the other situations. One time in particular, my girlfriend of over a year, who's never had a second personality, but did have this odd moment nonetheless. She was being goofy and jumping around and giggling. Seemed to be in a generally good mood. After a while, she kept doing it, to the point of exhaustion, where she could barely stand due to the laughter fit and jumping. I remember it getting to the point where I was thinking, okay, I'm glad you're in a good mood, but dial it down a little bit. As there was nothing in that moment to me that made sense for her to be continuing to do this behavior as long as she did. She had never done this before. Was typically a Daria low-energy type, you know? As she continued jumping up and down and giggling, it began to feel less like her, and I started to look and feel almost unnatural to me. I know it sounds stupid as I describe it, but that's how it felt in the moment. I tried to tell her, okay, calm down now, but every time she would maybe take a breath or two before going again. Finally, I told her, okay, for real, stop. You're starting to freak me out. That's when her face changed. She seemed devious, excited, focused, and aggressive. She got in my face, cornered me, saying stuff like, "Really? Am I freaking you out? Is this scaring you?" I yelled and begged for her to stop, on the verge of tears because of my previous experience. I was terrified. She stopped, and her face went back to normal. She looked remorseful, scared, and was apologizing profusely. She said that she did not know what happened, that she felt this feeling while she was weak from laughter and gave into it, that she wasn't in control. It never happened with her again, and she never acted anything like that before or after this. My mother's story. I've no reason to doubt her, and she's never told anyone or been concerned with the supernatural. She does have a vaguely spiritual streak, but that's all. Mostly, she's pretty no-nonsense. When she retired, she got heavily into family history. At some point, she obtained the diary of my dad's mother, who passed away perhaps 20 years previously, who we all call Nan. Nan had been very stiff and a proper English type, called everyone dear, used adjectives like terribly and perfectly dreadful, and was always relentlessly formal, and seemed to be slightly offended at all times. She was also an intensely private person, and never wanted anyone knowing her business. So one night, my dad was away and my mother, home alone, sits down with the diary and starts going through it. It starts raining. Nothing unusual, since they live on the coast. She gets up and closes a few windows, goes back to the diary. The rain turns into a storm. It gets windy. She goes to the other room and shuts the windows there. Comes back to the diary. A few more minutes go by. She's been looking at the diary for maybe 15 minutes at this point. Suddenly, the intercom to her right bursts to life at full volume, with just static coming through the speaker. They live in a 3-story house on the side of a hill that was originally built by an electrician, so there are a million lights, PowerPoints on every wall, and every room has an intercom. After recovering from the fright, she turned off the intercom. The one in the next room is still going full blast. She gets up and shuts that off, and can hear the rest of the house. Downstairs, still going, every intercom. She heads down to the middle level, where the master unit is, and turns the intercom off. She's heading upstairs when she notices all the pictures on the walls. My mother is heavily into hanging things on the walls. Big, small, painting, family photos. There's a lot of frames on the walls. They were all askew. All at similar angles, not random. Meanwhile, the storm has increased. The floor she is on is lined the length of the house on the side with timber-framed windows. Even the tops of the windows are wet with rain, which rarely happens and takes a proper storm to do. As she stood there, taking this all in, what she can only describe as an intense gust of wind rattles the windows from one end of the house to the other, as if a speeding train went past on the balcony outside. Instead of fleeing into the night in search of a hotel room and real estate agent, as I would have done, she walks calmly upstairs, calmly shuts the diary, calmly puts it into the cupboard, shuts the cupboard, says, "Sorry, Nan," to the empty room, and goes to make a cup of tea. The storm dies down. She writes all the pictures, and that's that. Here's the kicker. Someone from her work lives in the same street, like 10 houses away. When she sees him the next day, she mentions the storm. "What storm?" comes the reply. She's like, "What do you mean, what storm? I'm talking about the gale force storms we had last night." The guy looks at her funny and says he wouldn't have known if there was a storm since they had dinner on the balcony last night and there wasn't a storm at any point. Reading this back sounds completely made up. I can only swear it isn't. I lack the imagination to make up something like this. Shout out to Nan if she's somehow reading this. I promise I won't be reading your diary. When I was 17 years old, I went to school 1 hour too early. When I was 17 years old, I once got woken up by my dad, since he used to wake me up always before he would take a walk with the dog. First, he would wake up my older sister to use the bathroom before me, and when she was done, he would wake me up. Okay, now what's weird is, he just woke me up and I was following up my morning rituals, staying in bed for another 5 minutes. Then switched on the light, waking up fast and hard, followed by going straight into the bathroom, getting myself ready here, and going to the kitchen to get myself a small breakfast. My dad mostly came back in around that time, and I was done eating and preparing myself to leave for school by cycling towards the bus stop. So I did. I went to the bus stop, got on the bus, stepped over to the second, and finally arrived at school. But here's something that really blew my mind. My school was closed. I started wondering and checked up my online school platform to check if maybe they sent me, maybe it was a general day off. But no. Then I called my mother to check if maybe she knew what happened here. When I called her, she asked how I already was at school that day. I simply was 1 hour too early at school. I really got the chills because everything in my ritual really looked the same, beside the fact that I indeed was alone on the buses or at the bus stop. But my dad did wake me up, and after checking if maybe the wintertime changed, they do this in my country, turning back our clock once a year. In summers, we turn it back. Did I start to really feel like it was my dad's fault? But till this day, I really don't know. I just decided to go get myself a hot chocolate milk at the gas station next to school. I didn't really give it a lot of attention, since I still had to wait for my school to open. Now, 7 years later, I really ask myself, what's been going on there? I don't remember if I've even seen my sister that day. I don't remember that it was like an hour ago and too dark outside, less cars on the way to the bus stop, and on the bus itself, it's all vague. Sure, the last bus I remembered taking at that moment was pretty empty, and there would have been indeed more people on it. But I didn't even notice it. But I find it really disturbing that my dad woke me up. What was he experiencing that day? Being too early at work? I don't remember coming home that day and even speaking about it. It does feel like a dream, It's weird. Back in 2008, I experienced something I never did before or since. I'm only 22, so this happened to me when I was 7. I've remembered this for years, and nothing before or since has happened to me. I don't even think it was sleep paralysis. I was fully awake whenever this happened. And I was able to move my body completely. But, to give you some insight into what you think, demons, sleep paralysis, or ghosts? Anyway, I was 7. Me, my mom, and my dad, who are divorced now, used to live in this little gray house from 2007 to 2008. It was actually pretty cute looking, but my parents used to fight in it all the time, which seemed like it only started whenever we moved into this house. Because weirdly before, I only had happy memories of how my parents treated each other, and didn't remember nearly as much violence as what happened between my parents here. It could just be that I don't remember their fights, and that they took place before we moved into the house. However, I have a really good memory of everything else that's really specific during my childhood before that, such as our trip to Disney World that we took in 2006. I specifically remember no fights between my parents happening the entire time we were there. I can even remember the Kodak cameras my mom used to take pictures from back then. A white Disney-themed t-shirt that I remember wearing for the majority of our trip to this day. Seeing lots of lizards, me wanting to visit this one fake talking tree that had a face down there every day. I have a pretty good memory that's vivid from 5 and up. I even remember the specific apartments that we used to live in next to my mom's parents, my grandparents. Before we moved into this house, my experience I'm going to talk about took place in. My mom has always said my dad was violent and had anger issues even before I was born, when she met him, which I believe since to this day, he still has outbursts of anger. However, nothing I remembered was as bad as the fights that happened between him and my mom whenever we moved into that house back in 2007. There would be screaming matches daily between my parents, which I would remember yelling at both of them to stop. My dad also constantly go out drinking around this time period and come home constantly making scary threats toward my mom to kill her, and he would sleep with weapons, which he threatened my mom with as well. Around this time, I remember constantly feeling afraid and watched after my parents, and they would tuck me into bed most of the time. What didn't help was that they would always leave my door open, so I always felt like I was being watched by the pitch darkness between the hallway. My door at the other end of the hallway, where our spare bedroom and our family computer was. You could say it was pretty common for kids to be scared of the dark, but I haven't gotten to my main experience yet. It wasn't uncommon for me to wet the bed at this time, and I'd go wake my parents up and sleep with them as a result of my fears. On the night my experience happened, this was one of those many times. I only remember that my mom wasn't in bed, so I went to sleep with my dad. I can't remember exactly the reason why, but might have already separated around this time of year, or my mom might have been out. While me and my dad were in the middle of trying to lay down and going to sleep, I just remembered that I couldn't fall asleep that night. I was laying down, and so was my dad, but I just couldn't sleep, and at some point, I remember Dad's little TV that he had in his room flashing blue, making a static noise. However, I remember I told my dad this, and he didn't believe me and told me to go to sleep. Eventually, a few minutes, I started noticing what looked like these creatures to the right side of me, one waddling on the bed towards me, and some to the right of me on the floor. The one of them that was on the bed, endlessly waddling towards me, kept looking at me and turning its head to the left on repeat. Two of the same creatures were on the floor, standing to the right of the bed doing the same thing. They all resembled penguins to me, but they were all pure gray and black. They seemed to be made of pure static. You could make a beak out of the body shape, as well as wings. However, I can't remember what their feet looked like exactly. At the same time that I saw them, I was also seeing and feeling other things in this room that shouldn't have been there, such as I eventually started feeling the sensation of worms crawling on my body, and I remember that I could also see them. To my left on the wall, there looked to be what's hard to describe as a giant strip of lettuce. The giant strip of lettuce was lining the creature, and it was moving with small, little, skinny, stringy tentacles on the side, and like a purple mask in the center of it. This whole time I was telling my dad I was seeing some things, and that was making me nervous, and I was making whimpering sounds like a scared child does. But I remember he kept saying that he didn't see anything, and nothing was going on. I think he thought I was just fighting sleep, but I was genuinely seeing things, and at one point, I tried waving my arm toward this waddling creature's body, but it just went straight through. This all lasted for about an hour from what I can remember, before they all slowly start to disappear. To this day, nothing similar has ever happened to me since or before that incident, so I'm convinced I at least experienced interdimensional creatures myself. I later found out whenever we moved into that house from my mom's ears later that every single couple who's lived there has apparently broken up. But I don't know how true that is. I also heard that the house was built on an Indian burial ground. What do y'all think? I may have experienced back when I was a kid. It also feels not long after this. That's when I got stuck with chronic depression and anxiety and paranoia. It's still present to this day. Is it weird that I kind of miss the spirit I grew up with? Before I was born, my mom had been standing in front of the kitchen sink when she felt a hand on her shoulder. When she turned, there was no one there. On a different day, my dad had been standing on the same spot in front of the kitchen sink when he felt my mom hug him from behind. However, when he turned around to hug her back, there was no one there. Growing up, there is always strange, inexplicable incidences. I don't remember much before my teen years, but as a teenager, this spirit seemed to take a particular interest in me. Maybe it was because I acknowledged her. I wasn't afraid. My aquarium light would turn on in random setting on its own. And more than once I felt someone behind me when I was home alone. My bedroom door was also a little bit open every now and then, as if Mom was checking on me or someone had slipped into my room. There was a shadow figure that I often wrote off as being in my head, but 2 of my friends saw the shadow person moving throughout the house the same night but at separate times. My older sister came to visit once when I was about 15. She brought a Ouija board with her and managed to coax me into trying roughly at midnight that night. Once our parents were in bed, our mom never wanted us to touch the Ouija board due to really bad experiences of her own. Curiosity got the better of me though, so we set up the board in front of the kitchen sink. Soon enough, the planchette was moving to our questions. I thought maybe my sister was playing with me, but she's too boring for that. Here are some of the questions and answers. Question: where are you from? Britain. Are you a woman? Yes. When did you die? 42. When were you born? 4. Were you a mother? Yes. How many kids did you have? 2. Are you attached to something in the house? Yes. What are you attached to? No answer. Do you know who this is? My sister talking about me. Yes. Spells out my full name. Did you watch us grow up? Yes. Were you the one turning on my aquarium lights and such? Yes. How did you die? An unintelligible answer. At about that point, the answers became mostly indecipherable, so we decided to say goodbye. Other things have happened since, which I attribute to the spirit just telling us she was still around. I sadly moved out a few years after the Ouija experience, but I keep thinking about that spirit. She was born and died roughly 2,000 years ago in Britain and was now attached to something in our house in Australia. I have no idea what she could possibly be attached to in this house and how it got there. Apparently, when my family sold my childhood home, where all this happened, the spirit was extra active. My mom said it was as if she was protesting us leaving. I find myself missing this mysterious spirit that watched me grow up. My current house feels quite empty without any paranormal activity in it, and she was definitely the kindest spirit I've encountered so far. Probably the most strongest experience I've had with the paranormal. So it's around 9:40 p.m. I was driving home from work. I'm on my street and I see this small fluffy dog, but this was different because a stray dog or cat that would always run away, but this one stood extremely still like a statue. I've noticed he had deep dark eyes, and I start to get a bad feeling. So I honked my car horn to get it to move or react, but nothing, not even a flinch. So I approach the dog. I suddenly get this uneasy feeling the dog is staring at me, and I felt even more uneasy, so I continued driving, and 5 feet away from the dog, it started to walk toward my car. And suddenly I have this deep fear that there was something chasing me from behind my car. My adrenaline kicks in, my heart pounds. I press on the gas to attempt to outrun this thing. It is chasing behind my car as I press on the gas. I get this vivid image in my mind that it's an 8-foot figure chasing right behind my car. My adrenaline's still running. I look in the mirror and see nothing. It's dark out. I get to the gate and I immediately look back to see nothing, but still have that feeling that I'm being watched in the shadows of the dark. It's not until I've gotten home that I felt safe and secure, and the feeling of being watched is gone. I used to have a dark closet in my room, and I heard weird things. So back when I was younger, I lived in a big house. In my room, there was always this dark, dusty closet that I never used. To get to it, you had to crawl through a small door, a little smaller than half the size of a normal door. I never went in there for a reason. For one, the room was covered in children's drawings all over, words, pictures, and other disturbing and unexplainable stuff I'm not going to say. Oh, and a quick note. I wasn't like 16 in this story. I was like 8 or 9. So for the first few years in this house, nothing ever happened. It was peaceful. But eventually, we had to take off the door for a reason I forget. When my dad first took the door off, it was fine. It smelled a little dusty in my room, but nothing really happened. However, that night, I couldn't sleep. All I smelled was something rotting. I kept smelling this for another 3 nights. I didn't want to tell my parents as they were busy all the time while this was happening, so it would just be a hassle for them. I could only smell rot during the night, so I decided to go looking for what it might be. I looked all over my room and found nothing. The last place to check was the closet, and there was a pile of dead, rotting rats, at least 8 of them. I screamed, and my parents came, cleaned up the rats, confused on how they got in. Thought this was the end? Wrong. The next night, I was hearing creaking floorboards and something mushy moving in my room. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't fall asleep. The next morning, I found all of my dolls had black paint on them and holes in their face. I ran to my parents asking if they did it. They said no. I asked my cousin that had been over a few days before, and she said no. I didn't really have friends at the time because we lived in the middle of nowhere, so there's no one else to ask. The next morning, I had a smudge of black paint on my face. Our paint is still in the boxes in the storage room, so I was confused. Once I got the paint off, I realized underneath the paint I was bleeding. Not a terrible amount, but more than the amount from a paper cut. The next night, I decided to go into the closet and found a small white board with a heart on it. And that was the last night I was hearing stuff. It was weird and uncomfortable. For all I know, it could have just been a prank, but there are some things that I don't think you would do in a prank. Either way, I just recently remembered this and wanted to share it. It's not the most creepy story on this page, but whatever. Something is haunting me at night after 2 a.m. I live in my university hostel, and I share a room with 3 other people. It's an average-sized room for everybody, and we live with brotherly love, helping each other and every other thing. My room contains 4 beds, 4 cupboards, and 4 study tables. It has a balcony, and right in front of the balcony is the end of campus. And from right there is 3 buildings of another boys' hostel and a girls' hostel, but the 3rd building is a broken building, less than half burnt with no windows. Recently, I and my other roommate went home for 3 days, leaving the other 2 in the room. When I came back, they sat down and said something was on our balcony staring at us, and knocked several times. I thought they were playing with me, as they always do, but it was kind of unsettling because the balcony is all covered with windows. Next day, I'm going to sleep at 2:30, and I hear 1 knock on the window. And I was wearing earphones, and I just ignored it. Second time the knock was made, I saw my roommates, and they were in deep sleep, so I covered my face with a blanket and went back to bed. Next day, I tell my roommates all that happened yesterday night. They said maybe you witnessed that too. I thought no way it could be a paranormal thing. So I fooled around the balcony and sweared at everything out there knocking on the door. Then at night, they asked me to go where the knock exactly seemed like it was. So I showed them by knocking on the window. Exactly after 2 seconds, a double knock on the balcony door was there. All my roommates were staring at each other. Thought it was one of us who knocked as a joke. But another double knock came, which was the most chaotic feeling in my mind I've ever felt. Everyone switched off the lights, covered their face with blankets. The knocking didn't stop till 3:30 in the morning, and being made on the door and every side of the window. It still happens sometimes, But I investigated everything on my balcony, and there's nothing that can possibly make a noise except a mouse which died a month ago. And I live on a really high floor with nothing to be climbed on by an animal. And it was a very clear knock on the window, which a small rat or a mouse can't make. What is this? What can it be? Should I be worried? What should I do? What do you think this means? So I saw a hat man this morning. Just a tall shadow person wearing a hat. No discernible features, just a dark gray figure with a hat. Although I would describe the outline of his hat as being like a fedora. I was wide awake laying in bed when I looked toward the foot of the bed and saw him standing over me. I looked away and looked back and he was gone. I didn't feel any maliciousness from him though. It felt very neutral. This isn't the weirdest part. So a whole time zone away, the same morning, my mother was also awakened by something. She said she looked and just caught an arm and a hand. Then she looked away, thinking it was just my stepdad at the end of the bed coming back from the bathroom or something. But she turns over and realizes that it wasn't, because he's still in bed sound asleep. This is probably a half or maybe a whole hour before I saw my shadow person. So when I was seeing this shadow, my mom says she couldn't get it out of her head and that she needed to text me. And this was at 4:30 or 5 her time. She would never text me that early normally. So she waited an hour and then she texted me asking if I was doing okay. And I asked her if she is mostly doing okay because this is still early for her to be reaching out. We didn't tell each other about what we individually saw this morning till several hours later after work when we could talk on the phone. Experience at work. Hey guys, yesterday I had an extremely strange experience and I'm wondering if anyone could give me some insight. I'm a maid and a housekeeper for a residential home. So yesterday I saw that a house I'd never been to before was on my schedule. I noticed while looking at my schedule a couple hours later that my coworker, who was originally supposed to work the shift at this house with, was no longer on. We were cleaning a house together at this time, so I asked her about it, and she said she made someone else take her shift because she was too scared to go there. She just said that last time she was there, she felt uneasy and like something didn't want her there. She said that she was having a real bad anxiety all week knowing she had to go back to that house yesterday. This house was probably built in the 60s or maybe 70s. Recently, the homeowners had been doing some renovations. This is allegedly when things started to really feel in this house. I was also informed that a different coworker has heard someone running up the basement stairs at this house when no one's home. I was told that the grandparents of the family living there had passed away too, at some point. So I went into this feeling very nervous, but ultimately I decided to tough it out. When I walked inside, I immediately felt a super heavy weight on my head and shoulders. It was extremely dense. However, at the time, I didn't feel dread or fear, just a great heaviness. It was also hard to breathe, like you just can't inhale enough air. I was emotionally fine until about the last half hour of the clean. I was starting to get really scared, even though nothing was happening. I kept seeing things in my peripheral vision, but told myself it was just my nerves getting the better of me. I will say that when I mopped the floor near the basement stairs, I suddenly had an overwhelming urge to get the fuck out of that room, like fight or flight. I dropped my mop and ran out of the room while looking behind me so fast that I hit my shoulder on the doorframe trying to get away. I've never felt like that without a good reason, so I'm very spooked out about what could have happened if I hadn't left the room. As soon as I walked out of the house when we had finished, and even more so, I drove away, I could feel this intense weight lifting off of me, and I could breathe deeply again. So nothing really happened, but it was super distressing. The girl I was with there said she started to feel scared when we went upstairs. By the end of the clean, she had a splitting headache. When I told my coworker, who refused to go to the heaviness I had felt, she said she had felt the exact same thing when she was there. I told my boyfriend about this, and he suggested it could be a gas leak. That very well may be, but I guess I'm just looking for your opinions on this. Could a gas leak explain all of this? Or is something else going on? I work for a 200-year-old church. It's haunted. The church campus consists of the sanctuary, the office, and the empty, decrepit house where all the priests used to live that was later used as a meeting space until it was condemned. And lastly, a cemetery, with the oldest grave being those of World War 1812 soldiers. All of the buildings have stone exteriors. A priest died in the house in the late 1800s. He was old, so nothing nefarious there. But he still haunts the place, which seems odd to me. Since he was a priest and obviously believed in heaven, why stick around? When I first started working there, I was in the office with a member of the congregation who told me that on several occasions when they left the old house and turned the lights off, they would turn around and see lights that had switched back on inside through the windows. I believe in the paranormal, and I've had an experience myself, so I was intrigued. When I left the office that day myself, I turned off the lights. At the last light switch, I felt almost an electric buzz through my finger. The office itself is old, so I wouldn't have been surprised if something wasn't grounded right. Didn't think anything unusual about it. I went back to my desk to grab my things and lock the door, and the light switch I had turned off was on. Keep in mind, this was the same day as when I found out about the priest. I've tried asking him again to show me any sign that he's there, but he's never done anything else in 4 years I've been working there. But without asking, I've seen flashes of light in the dark windowless room. I'm not sure if it was pareidolia, but I saw a man cross in front of the headlights and disappear. He had dark hair and he was wearing a white shirt. I once unlocked the deadbolt on the door of the church, and when I went to turn the knob to go inside, something turned it the opposite way in my hand. This was during lockdown, so definitely no one was inside, and I ran. I've seen motion detector lights outside turn on by themselves. And when I've jumped in front of them, waving my hands, they'd never come on. I heard this one from my boss, who's a priest. The organist was practicing by themselves in the church when a pencil went flying across the room. My boss also told me that the members said that they've seen the priest looking out of the windows of the house. The decrepit house is supposed to be torn down within the next year or two. I'm not sure how it'll affect the priest. He won't leave, or maybe he finally will. Anyone else have any haunted workplace stories? I never thought I'd end up working at a funeral home. However, I found the job opportunities were limited, and when I came across a listing in the local paper, the money was too good to pass up. They even had an attached residence that I could live in rent-free, to ensure I was always on hand, since I was their only security guard. Sometimes the job can be somewhat unnerving. Being surrounded by death on a daily basis takes a toll on a person, but I remind myself that I'm here to keep the place secure and to make sure everything runs smoothly. Every night before turning in, I take a walk through the building to ensure that the doors are locked and the lights are off. I check on the mourners, attend evening services, if one is scheduled, making sure that they aren't causing any trouble or breaking any rules. I get up periodically through the night to make my rounds and ensure all is well. If I hear anything out of the ordinary, I investigate it. At first, I thought that the job would be a piece of cake. All I had to do was patrol the building at night, keep an eye on the cameras, and ensure that no one was trying to break in. Beyond the morbid appeal, this place provides the young thrill seekers. There are also chemicals stored in here that an enterprising criminal could use to manufacture narcotics, so intruders were a concern worth noting. However, As I settled into my new role, I began to realize that the job was more than what I anticipated. The funeral home itself was pretty creepy, with dimly lit hallways and creaky old doors. Every time I walked down one of these dark corridors, I couldn't help but feel like someone or something was watching me. Sometimes I hear strange noises coming from the side of the walls. Sometimes I see a shadow flash past the corner of my vision. Sometimes I swear I can feel a cold breath on the back of my neck. Despite my unease, I try to remain professional. After that, I am here to keep the place secure, not be spooked by every little sound. However, as the night wore on, I find it harder and harder to shake the feeling that something is not quite right. It wasn't until a few weeks into the job that things began to get strange, though. I was doing my usual rounds when I heard a noise coming from one of the rooms we used to stare prepped bodies in, their caskets for upcoming funerals. It sounded like something was shuffling around in there. I tried to tell myself a reasonable explanation, but I could not shake the feeling that something was not right. As I approached the door to the room, my heart started to race. I wondered if I was just acting paranoid, but the noise was unmistakable. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up and reached for the doorknob. I hesitated for a moment, trying to gather my courage. Finally, I turned the knob and pushed the door open, just a crack, trying to peek inside without making too much noise. The room was dark, but I could make out the shape of a casket in the center. I tried to remember if there was a funeral scheduled for the morning, but I couldn't recall seeing that on the schedule that day. I listened for a moment, but the shuffling noise had stopped. I pushed the door open a little further, and that's when I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. I spun around, my hand reaching for the flashlight on my belt, but there was nothing there. My heart was pounding now, and I could feel sweat starting to form on my forehead. I took a deep breath and stepped into the room, shining my flashlight around. The casket was still in the center of the room, and there didn't seem to be anything else out of place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I finished my patrol of the room quickly and made my way back to my apartment, trying to calm my nerves. It was going to be a long night. The next night, I heard the noise again. My heart sank as I realized the sound was not just in my head, but was coming from the same room as before. Once again, I decided to investigate the issue. I slowly made my way down the hallway, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. As I approached the door, my palms began to sweat and my breath became shallow. My personal experiences have taught me to remain calm under pressure. However, this was a different kind of fear. I pushed the door open slowly and peered inside, my eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement. To my surprise, there was nothing there. No people, no animals, no signs of disturbance. The room was empty, and the only thing that greeted me was an eerie silence. I stood there for a few moments, trying to make sense of what I heard. Was it just my imagination playing tricks on me? Had I been up too late? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but I also couldn't find any logical explanation for the noise. As I made my way back to my room, my mind was racing with thoughts and questions. Was there something in the funeral home that I didn't know about? I didn't want to jump to any conclusions, but I knew that I had to keep my guard up and stay alert. As the nights go on, the strange noises persist, and I begin to feel like I'm being watched. It's as if someone or something is following me through the halls. Every time I turn around, I expect to see a figure looming in the shadows, but there's never anything there. I start to become increasingly paranoid. I double-check the locks on the doors and windows every hour, just to make sure they're secure. I even start carrying a sidearm with me in my rounds, just in case. Things just continue to become even stranger. One night, as I was sitting in my apartment, I heard a series of strange noises coming from outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the sounds grew louder and more persistent until they sounded like someone knocking at the door. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was probably just some kids playing a prank, but the knocking continued, growing more insistent by the minute. It was as if someone was desperately trying to get my attention. Feeling a sense of unease, I cautiously approached the door and peered through the peephole. To my surprise, there was no one there. The hallway was completely empty, and there was no sign of anyone lurking in the shadows. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As I returned to my apartment, I felt a chill blow past me into the apartment. Once inside, I couldn't help but notice the atmosphere had changed. The air felt thick and heavy, and there was an unexplained chill that seemed to permeate through every corner of the room. Uncomfortable, I retreated to my bedroom, hoping to get my mind off the night's events. However, the knocking continued sporadically throughout the night, each time causing my heart to race with fear. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, but the persistent tapping at the door made it clear that it was not. That's the moment when I realize I can't take it anymore. I need to find out what's causing these noises and put an end to it. The next day, I decided to talk to the funeral home director about my concerns. I half expected him to laugh it off and tell me I'm crazy, but to my surprise, he takes me seriously. He tells me that the funeral home has been rumored to be haunted for years, and that some of the staff have reported strange occurrences in the past. As time goes on, my interactions with the spirits are becoming more frequent and intense. I often hear whispers in my ear or feel a cold breath on my neck. Some nights, the spirits become angry and throw objects around the room. I've taken to talking to them as much as I make my rounds, really, as it makes me more comfortable, and I believe it helps calm the spirits. I've begun to realize that not all spirits behave the same. Some are friendly and curious, whereas others are vengeful and aggressive. It's as if they each have their own story to tell, and I'm the only one who can hear them. Despite my growing attachment to the spirits, I've still had moments of fear and doubt. There are nights when I hear something so terrifying that I just freeze in place, too afraid to move. But then a warm feeling comes over me, reminding me that I'm not alone and that everything's going to be okay. I started to document my experience in a journal, detailing the encounters I had with the spirits and the strange occurrences that happened each night. I've even begun to research the history of the funeral home, hoping to uncover clues about the spirits and their motives. I haven't had much luck yet, but I'm optimistic. Although my job is unusual, I find a sense of purpose in my interactions with the dead. I know what I'm doing is something important, something that no one else could do as well. And who knows, maybe one day, I'll even be able to solve the mystery of this place and help the spirits find peace. What are your stories from haunted hotels? When I was in high school, my mother was married to a man named Donald. Now, Donald was a drunk. He worked a good job and made good money, so he provided for us well enough. But he filled his free time chugging vodka like water, and always wore his underwear on the couch. Donald wasn't always aggressive when he drank. However, after a hard day at work, he would come home, drink a bottle, and try to pick fights with me or anything he could think of. Very often these fights would turn out physical, and while I was no lightweight in high school, on the first occasion I fought back and he called the cops on me. As a result of this particular situation, once he was about 3/4 of the way through the bottle, my mother took to packing an overnight bag, having me load up and going to stay in a hotel for the night. I always stayed in the same hotel just down the street from my house, since it would allow me to go back home before school the next morning after Donald had left to go to work and get ready. It was a nice place with a huge open foyer, and all the rooms were surrounded by 5 stories. I knew the ladies at the desk really well, as I was there 5 or 6 times a month. On the occasion in question, I'd gone over fairly late in the evening. The hotel had a 24-hour booking at the front desk, but the girl behind the desk mentioned that they were booked up all night. I breathed an exasperated sigh as I was relayed the news and mentioned I was just going to catch a bus. The girl behind the desk mentioned that there was a room she could put me in at a discounted rate, no less. She was, however, hesitant to do so, saying the owner of the hotel had taken it out of service for reasons unknown to her. but that she knew I'd be gone before the owner would arrive in the morning, and she could fudge it in the system to look like the room hadn't been occupied. I thanked her for this and accepted, not caring for the other options I had available to me at the time. So I got the key and went into the room, got undressed, showered, and settled into bed. I noted that despite her reservations, the room was immaculate. I simply couldn't fathom why a perfectly good room wasn't being rented out, but I decided not to look a gift horse in the mouth. The room was pretty standard as far as a hotel room goes. A single queen-size bed, a TV on the wall to your left, a desk to your right, a mirrored closet door across the bed with a table next to it, and a ceiling fan just past the foot of the bed. I fell asleep sometime around 11 to the sound of the TV playing some late-night cop drama. Quite comfortable in the bed until around 2:30, I wasn't awoken by a sound as much of the lack of sound. You never really realize how jarring silence is until it occurs suddenly at night. As I rose to sit up, I took a note of the time on the alarm clock, and I noticed that the TV had turned off. The room was illuminated by light, and the parking lot poured in through the blinds as my vision sharpened and the room properly came into focus. I noticed that I wasn't alone. At the foot of the bed was a woman. She was wearing a hotel bathrobe. Her hair was darkened by water, as if she had just gotten out of the shower, and notably, was quite tall. The top of her head was just 2 feet or so below the ceiling fan. She just stood at the foot of the bed with her head cocked to one side and stared at me. She didn't say anything. She didn't even move. At some point during this exchange, I'd convinced myself I was dreaming, and there was no woman in my room, so despite her standing there staring at me, I wasn't afraid. I had just been having hyper-realistic dreams since I was a kid after all. So I simply laid back down and watched her stand there, my head tilted so I could keep an eye on her, knowing that if I waited, she would simply disappear, and she did. I fell back asleep and slept through my morning wake-up call. The lady at the front desk sounded a bit nervous when she called, so I quickly got dressed and headed to the front desk, thinking her boss may be coming sooner than expected. I wasn't expecting the conversation I had at the front desk as I checked out. When I walked up, she started apologizing to me. I was confused, so I calmed her down and asked her to explain. What had her so stressed? She took a breath and said, "I found out why the room was taken out of service. Come to find out, 2 weeks before I stayed in that room, a woman stayed there on vacation with her husband and 2 kids. She stayed behind while they went to grab breakfast one morning. She took a shower, put on her bathrobe, and hung herself from the ceiling fan with a bedsheet. Her husband found her there when he got back. The room was removed from service as a matter of good taste until the services were held. I didn't know any of this beforehand, and it makes me wonder, did I see her in my room? Was that her that night, or was it just a dream?" My parents moved into this house with my older siblings and I before I was even 1 year old, and we lived in that house for over 20 years. Strange things happened sporadically over the years we lived there. It got to the point that I refused to even step foot back in. These are what I can remember since it's been a few years after we moved out of that house. I was around 5 or 6, and it was storming outside. My siblings and I were watching TV. Every now and again, we would hear the front door close, even though the door was already closed to begin with. Our parents were already asleep in their room. After hearing it close maybe 5 times, I rushed upstairs and forced myself to sleep. That was the only time it happened. One time when I was in 9th grade, I woke up in the middle of the night. In my sleepy haze, I thought I saw a woman in her mid-40s with blonde hair. She was standing in the corner, but where a dresser stood as well. I blinked to try to clear my head, but that woman was gone after that. It freaked me out. I thought I was losing my mind and I was seeing things that weren't there. Now this event occurred when I was at college. I was home alone and no appliances were on. My laptop was running. It was basically quiet in the house. Then I heard 2 muffled voices, a man and a woman conversing with one another. I looked around the house to try to find out where it was coming from, but found nothing, and I was still alone in the house. Other times when all of us would leave and come back after dark, we would see that the basement light was on. This was when we all stopped going down to the basement long ago. At other times, the pets that we had would speak to an empty space or just maybe stare at nothing. After a beloved pet died, my older sister and I would sometimes hear something running up and down the stairs. My sister and friends of hers witnessed the TV turn on by itself. The remote was nowhere near them. Another time she saw a figure in the middle of her room. After a second, it vanished. She would see a figure in a tree outside her window, but would turn around when she changed her clothes. And of course, things would disappear and sometimes turn back up. Whatever didn't turn back up, just replaced or accepted that it was gone. Yeah, we were able to endure a lot. We couldn't move out because we didn't have a lot of money. My siblings and I moved out of that house a few years ago, and my parents followed. We haven't had anything strange or abnormal happen since. The Musician Ghost. My mom and dad went to a small Mexican town to visit the tombstone of a musician who sadly passed away. The thing about the town was how poor people were. No one would have casual, fancy clothes apart from two reasons. They're either getting married or buried. So my mom and dad got there late at night, and while looking for his tombstone, end up locked in. They keep looking until my mom splits up going into the building next to the graves with more tombstones. She makes a turn and sees this tall, pale man in a black suit. She asks him where the tombstone of the musician was, and jokingly said, "Wow, you scared me." He doesn't respond or look at her, but just points in a direction. She goes there and meets up with my dad. They found the tombstone in the direction pointed, and when my dad asked who the man was, she came to the realization that they were locked in. No one should have been there, far less in a black suit. The Crying Child. This story takes place when I'm now 30-year-old sister was 6 or 10. She was going to school and had left with my dad. My mom was inside cooking when she heard what sounded like a kid crying. She's not a paranormal nut job, so her first idea was maybe my sister got mad with my dad and ran inside and I just didn't hear the door. So she goes upstairs. Once upstairs, the cries stop. She thinks maybe she's hearing things, so she goes back down without checking. After hearing it again, she looks around this time. She described it as if the cries constantly changed from location, from the guest room to the laundry to my sister's room. Now in my sister's room, she hears it from her closet and thinks that it's right behind it, and it was my sister, calling out for her as she goes into the closet and turns on the light, only for the crying to stop. When my dad got home, she questioned him, but he didn't know what he had heard. The Mimic. This one is the most real, since 2 people vouch for it. So my dad and grandma had recently got home. My dad picking my grandma up from her house to have dinner at our place. At the time, my dad had gotten home from work and was dead tired. Knocking on the metal gate in front of our house, he yelled out for our sister. "Sister, open up the gate." She responded, "Wait, I'm coming." After waiting for a while, he called her again, now pissed, and again she yelled out, "Wait, I'm coming." The thing to note here is that, 1, the gate makes it practically impossible for someone to see inside. 2, the voice was clearly my sister's. So after waiting for a while, he now angrily calls my mom to see what my sister could be doing. When she picked up and heard what she was going on, she was baffled and she said, "She's with me." My mom had picked up my sister directly from school and they went shopping. She drove back home, worried that someone broke in. When they got inside, they found no one hidden and nothing stolen.